This is R.J. Rushdoony, easy chair number 383, April the 2nd, 1997. This evening, Douglas Murray, Andrew Sandlin, Mark Rushdoony, and I will discuss a number of questions that some of you have sent in, and we're very happy to get them. The first is a very difficult one. In some ways a very obviously easy one to answer, but there are all kinds of questions associated with it. It has to do with the perimeters of genetic research. This comes from David Ingram. What about genetic research, cloning, that sort of thing? Well, first of all, we have to take the question in its broadest sense of genetic research. There is nothing wrong with it up to a point. For example, not too many generations ago, the cattle of the Western world was not very healthy or nutritious. The cattle was inclined to be rather lean and often sickly. Then a number of developments took place. Some men led the way in calling for better breeding practices, and this greatly improved the strain of cattle, of sheep, other farm animals like chickens, so that their meat weight went up, their health went up, their ability to lay eggs went up. Now, from that perspective, you'd have to say genetic research is sound. At what point does it cross the line and become dangerous? A study was made a few years back in the 80s of the matter of artificial work in the form of implanting eggs and fertilizing them, all done artificially. You hear less about that nowadays because while it is still going on as much as ever, it does not bear close scrutiny. A great deal of the work here leads to monsters. The fetus is put to death, which is murder, and some of the women undergo hell because they've submitted to this kind of experimentation. Then there was a report recently on other aspects. For example, we've had an experiment with the cloning of sheep. Well, before we go into that, more than 10 years ago, we had with us, associated with Chalcedon and writing in the report, Timothy Vaughan, who had been a missionary in New Guinea and is currently in South Africa. Now, Tim told us about something which became a matter of news before long. He said that cannibalism in New Guinea led to a very serious ailment, kuru, K-U-R-U, in which the mind of the cannibals was seriously infected. Of course, something like that happened and was a relative of Kuru, in Britain. Cow madness. Because the cow and sheep were being fed processed food made with beef and sheep byproducts, these animals were turned into cannibals. And the results were deadly. Pictures, films of the cows as they became infected and staggered around, could not get up, are devastating. Well, their markets closed because nobody wanted to risk eating such beef and possibly catching cow madness. Now, that ban did not extend outside of Britain and perhaps one or two European countries, I don't know. The common market there may have ruled that it would be outlawed, but I don't know. Here it does not apply. And here we are beginning to find a few cases of cow madness in human beings. Peoples whose brains are being destroyed. Again, we see that tampering with nature, tampering with God's rules, can lead to problems. The same report indicated that there are fears that this may be happening in cases of organ transplants. Introducing the alien body into the body of a person can cause some very serious repercussions. So, we have now been given warnings to the effect that there are dangers here. Now, let me say parenthetically, I have not spoken on the issue. How valid and how true, how real is the cloning experiment that led to a sheep? There is so much deception in science, self-deception and a deception of the public, deception to get more grants. There's no reason to believe that this happened in that case. But we again don't know what could happen. Now, one of the things that can be a product from the comment of a scientist in any such thing as cloning of animals is that they are an unknown quantity. We don't know what their immunities are or their susceptibilities. Can they be a focal point of new infections that can spread to a great number of people? In other words, there's a great deal of recklessness here. As one scientist has said, we're going to play God. And that's what they're doing. But they're not God. So they're flirting with disaster. They're treading into uncharted territory as though there's nothing but good that lies ahead. And they have no reason for knowing that. Too many of the innovations of recent years are backfiring on all of us now. Then there is the moral issue. Should man play God? And the answer is obviously no. And this is the purpose of cloning. As one scientist said when organ transplants first took place, he said, this is all wrong. instead of trying to improve people's health and discover ways whereby they can avoid heart trouble or can recuperate without surgery from heart trouble, we're exploring ways in which we can show our cleverness, our ability to play God. I'm afraid there is too much truth to that. There is a moral premise here. We are trespassing on it. Genetic research is a way of saying, we are God. We can do these things. This is why they want to create artificial life. Then they can replace God. And this is why they are for controls in one sphere of life after another, not for any assumed benefits, but for the privilege of playing God.
Well, I think the dividing line is motivation of the people involved. People who enter this area of science to improve the food chain to feed people, if they're godly men and women, will steer clear of the pitfalls because they've got some guidelines to go by. But so much of science, or really pop science nowadays, is determined by how much money is there in it. You know, it almost sounds like one is cynical when you question the motives of the people in the scientific community, but it's been so consistent over the past 20 years in my memory that every year when the congressional grants have to be renewed, there are sudden cries in the newspapers and the media about whether, and it doesn't make any difference what the subject is, whether it's global warming or depletion of the ozone layer or whatever it is, it only comes coincident with Congress renewing the grants for studying these things. And when you scratch beneath the surface, NASA did a study over a 20-year period with over 50,000 monitoring stations, and there is no global warming. I mean, the temperatures are moving around as they've always done because the Earth is a self-regulating entity. But on average, there is no global warming. I spoke with the wife of a scientist who was down in the South Pole studying the so-called ozone depletion. And they really released very preliminary data that turned out to be erroneous because the ozone layer is like Swiss cheese that's on the move. There's holes in the ozone layer that keep moving around. So if you put a monitoring station in one location, obviously the amount of ozone is going to change from time to time. So they, all of these so-called crises that are supposed to affect mankind turned out to be poorly done science, premature findings. And the media trumpets these because it sells newspapers. Now the cloning issue, as Russ just brought up, it brings a question in my mind, over time, what weaknesses will be bred into the sheep which are part of the human food chain? For instance, susceptibility to disease or the ability to carry or perpetuate a disease is going to be generated by cloning. I think getting back to the motivation thing, if you've got godly men and women that have got some guidelines to go by, they're going to know what to do and what not to do. If they're, simply trying to improve the human food to feed people, then they're motivated by acceptable guidelines. But so many people in science nowadays are motivated strictly by money and the desire to enhance their quotes professional image. Well, to me, there's nothing professional about them. I mean, they're right up there along with Dr. Joseph Mengele, who was Hitler's chief experimenter in euthanasia and all of these areas, and we're falling into the same trap. The Western world is falling into the same trap. I think the element that was in the British situation with the cows was that they were grinding up the part of the animals that people wouldn't eat and feeding them back, which was the brains and so forth, and being fed back to the cows. Well, we're specifically warned not to do that. It's not like this is sudden undiscovered information. This information's been around for a long time. People at some time in the past probably paid dearly to find that out. And somebody wrote it down a long time ago, and we have these warnings from the past. But our scientists are so determined that they're going to somehow overcome what they perceive as the mistakes of the past or the inconclusive data of the past. They've become so arrogant that they're going to somehow overcome these objections. My concern is the motivation of the people involved, and I have seen so much of this grant thing. This country pours billions and billions of dollars into research, into particularly they're funneling it into universities so that they can control the educational process. The Department of Education has become the funnel to control the university system in this country, so that the federal government can control what is taught, they can control what is said, they can control everything that is disseminated into society by controlling the universities. And they do it with the money spigot. And these people who are researchers in these universities, they've become slaves to the federal money spigot. And I think they've given up all moral ground in a large number of cases. For instance, I was thinking the other day, why is it that hospitals have to have ethics committees to decide whether or not a procedure should be allowed? If the doctors have no ethics themselves, or don't want to take responsibility for their actions, apparently they designate these ethics committees to take the heat off the doctors, so that the doctors can go ahead and do what they want to do, and the ethics committees become the keeper of the public morals. And are they any more or less capable of making these decisions than the doctors themselves? I think not. So you got to go back to the motivation of the individuals. If they're godly men and women, they're more liable to make the right decisions than not. But people who give up that moral imperative that somebody has to make the right decision based on moral considerations, and everything is up to ethics committees, which are subject to no one's control. They're elected or appointed by hospital administrators whose only game is to make money. They are a money-making enterprise. And, morality goes out the window.
I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Boys from Brazil with Laurence Olivier.
Yeah.
You mentioned Mengele. That was sort of based on his life. This whole question of cloning brings up another issue. What types of people, A, who would be making the decisions about who's cloning, and B, what types of people would be cloned? Well, depraved people will want to clone handsome people, pretty people, intelligent people. Mm-hmm. And their man is again playing God. And this is another form of Darwinism, and evolutionary theory, the survival of the fittest. We want to produce some sort of master race. Now, of course, when they begin, they won't use that term. But when they find that they're able to do this, if, as Russ said, they are able to do it, then that's certainly what's going to happen. We go back to the Tower of Babel and to Genesis chapter 3, with man knowing or deciding for himself what is right and what's wrong. Then the sexual side. Many families would rather have boys than girls. China is a prime example. Not only in the abortion, but in the genetic field. And if it's possible to manipulate genes in such a way that we can get rid of, and the whole question of sexuality. The people, homosexuals, talk about this particular issue. Is it a genetic related trait or not? So there are all sorts of ramifications here, but fundamentally it's destroying the creator-creature distinction, with man deciding to be the creator.
Well, I think we need to define what genetic engineering is. Genetic engineering is going into the chromosomes and actually changing the arrangement of the chromosomes to control an effect. Now, we have chromosomes that will control whether we have blue eyes or brown eyes. There are chromosomes, they believe, which give some women an inclination to have breast cancer. And you hear a lot about this. They're searching for this gene that causes some people to develop breast cancer or other types
Down
of
syndrome,
Yes, that's an
additional.
And I think we hit on the key word here. What is the motive behind the research, and how will it be used? God created these genes, and He told us to have dominion over the earth, not dominion over other men. The same knowledge can be used for good and evil.
That's right.
The same surgical skills which can save a baby's life or a woman's life can also be used to perform an abortion. The same skills one man learns to improve his business for accounting purposes can teach another person how to be an embezzler if he uses it for the wrong person. Is interfering with the chromosomes, trying to alter chromosomes in an individual, let's say, in you or me, not necessarily creating another individual. Is that for the purpose of healing? If cancerous cells that cell could be altered and reintroduced to encourage the body to reject, that's a form of healing. Determining what someone is going to be like, or a child, is an extreme example of cloning. Another example of how knowledge can be used for good or ill. Something was developed about 30 years ago where a small amount of fluid is removed from a pregnant woman's womb that can easily tell whether the child is a boy or a girl. That is used by some people to determine whether they want to have an abortion. If a couple they have a boy and they want a girl, and they don't want another boy, some will choose to use that test to determine whether they have an abortion. It can also be used to prevent some tragedies. There are genetic illnesses which cause some babies to have a severe, not just an allergic reaction to milk, but a severe reaction to milk, which can kill them. And this is not easily, this can be determined by amniocentesis. It could be used to save that child's life or serious harm. When man wants to use this knowledge, we have to remember that man is very fallible. It's nice to think, well, if we can just figure out how to rearrange a few chromosomes here, we're gonna fix all the problems in the world. If we look at how we have taken something as simple as breeding, you mentioned cattle breeding, and how man sometimes uses breeding for wrong purposes, we can look at breeds of animals such as dogs that are bred very often for the wrong reason, because they look pretty. We work very hard to develop certain breeds of dogs so they look just perfect, so they can be in a show and they can conform to a very artificial standard. Dalmatians have just the right definitive, well-defined spots, well-distributed. the shape of the head is perfect, the curl of the tail is perfect, and these dogs, they've developed dogs so they look perfect according to an arbitrary standard, but the fact is there's a high percentage of deaf Dalmatians because man has worked very hard to breed them in such a way that he's created dogs that are relatively useless, in some cases very unhealthy. There are many inherited diseases that are very common in all the common breeds. That's why I say that the healthiest dogs are often mongrels, because these harmful recessive traits tend to be bred out. And working dogs that are such as Australian Shepherds that are sometimes funny looking, and they aren't too similar, but they're intelligent because they're used as ranch dogs still. They're some of the healthiest and most intelligent. Man makes mistakes, and we have to remember that. Now, something which we ought to bring up, which is one of the first objections that some people wrongfully bring up. If we create another life, all right, if we split an egg or something and we create another life, such as, the old Hitler thing that's been kicked around for many years, what about the soul? That's really not an issue. And the whole idea of creating, liberals or conservatives or, an evil race of men is not really an issue, because when identical twins are by definition clones, it's when the fertilized egg, for some reason we don't understand, decides to split. And that's why they look identical, because they have an identical set of chromosomes. And
they're not identical.
They're not really identical. They don't always look exactly identical. They sometimes have very different personalities, and they definitely have different souls, and sometimes different talents. So that's sort of a false issue, and it wouldn't be possible to create a super race because they're going to be very different. So the real issue is, I think, is man playing God, and to what extent is interfering with the chromosomes designed to benefit man, and to what extent would some use that to play God? I don't think we can say it's all wrong.
That's right.
Because we can't say all medicine's wrong because of abortion and some of the things that have been done in the name of medicine.
Well, technology's not evil, man's evil.
Right.
Technology can be used for evil or for good purposes. When you were talking about for medical reasons, if these things are used, genetic research is used by doctors for restorative purposes, as you were talking about, to heal, that's one thing. If it's used for creative purposes, man playing God, I think that's where we should draw the line.
Mm-hmm. I have no doubt that lamb that was born was genuine. I have a textbook that's close to about 10 years old, I believe, described the identical procedure that the newspaper described about that. And this book said this is going to happen down the road, because just as soon as the techniques develop, we know it's theoretically possible, and before long it's going to happen. So, but man can use that same knowledge to, like I say, do some very evil things and monstrous things. And what is going to be the reaction? We have to remember what evil men will use as a backup to what if we try to help this child, even theoretically. We're trying to help this child, mm-hmm. and we do something genetically to help this child, and it creates a deformity instead. Well, we know with abortion what the line of mm-hmm. argument is going to be. We did the best we could. Maybe now they will say the humane thing is abortion or infanticide.
Mm-hmm.
See.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when evil men start to play God,
That's
all
right.
kinds of other arguments may start coming into play as well.
Think about the idea of gun control. Guns aren't bad. Technology's not bad. People are bad. You're right. And if godly people are involved in this, or people that operate according to godly principles, then by and large they won't violate the law of God. But you're right. If they're evil, wicked men who have an evil ideology, depraved ideology, will use it to glorify man at God's expense.
One of the problems with this type of experimentation is that man is in charge, not God. And man will clone what he feels he needs. And the results can be disastrous. For example, in the past couple of centuries, there have been experiments in all kinds of ideal colonies, utopian colonies. And I wrote about one in the Chalcedon Report some years ago, and that essay is in From the Roots of Reconstruction. Some of the most brilliant minds were collected in a colony, I believe, in Ohio. Excellent piece of property, large area of land, some very fine buildings put up, but they were intellectuals. And as a result, they had no common sense. They had not been there long when a horse pulling an overloaded wagon got mired in a mud hole. So they held meeting after meeting after meeting, trying to decide what the solution was. Nobody went out there and gave a hand. They were all intellectuals. So the horse died while they were debating day after day their solution. Well, scientists with cloning will reproduce a lot of people comparable to those on that colony. They won't think of reproducing the common people unless it's to turn them into, after Plato, a slave class of workers. Well, Douglas, you referred to the ozone layer and global warming and all the extravagant statements made by scientists. Because science has done a great deal, there is a great deal of arrogance here. Now, much of the work of science has been due to inventors rather than professors. And we assume that the technology is the work of scientists, and it isn't. It's the work of men who are in research and development for very practical reasons and are despised by scientists. The only thing that scientists actually did produce of any major note was the atomic bomb. Apart from that, most of our advance has been due, our technological, so-called scientific advance has been due to men working in connection with industry for very practical reasons. And this has been resented as the Wright brothers' innovation, a flying machine, was resented. After all, they were two bicycle mechanics, not scientists, and they never forgave them. And the brothers lived and died in bitterness at the treatment they received. And even within the past 10 years, the federal government had the nerve to put out an airmail stamp with Samuel Langley's name and plane on it, and his plane couldn't fly. It crashed. Of course, after the Wright brothers, they corrected the mistakes in the Langley plane after the Wright experiment. So they could say, well, Langley had the principles of flight. That's science for you. And they haven't changed at all. They're striving for power. Now, Clinton talked about a temporary ban, and it's just a kind of a temporary thing with no bite to it on cloning research. But the experiments will continue. Nobody will be able to stop the scientists unless there's a changed religious climate in the United States and around the world that says no more of this.
Well, some wag said that the reason that the Democratic National Committee had raised all that money Was it so they could donate it to cloning research to generate more liberals so they'd be assured of winning the next election?
Yes. Well, it is interesting. You mentioned, Andrew, I believe, and I think you referred to it, Mark, the homosexuals. Now, this is a boon for them because it's a blow at marriage as they see it. And it will enable them to clone what they want on order, given the kind of order they want. So the implications of cloning research are diabolical. The men, a high percentage of them involved in it, enjoy playing God. So we have to take a stand against it and say, this is morally wrong. It's going to be hard for Christians to do that because they don't believe in God's law. And since they don't believe in God's law, they believe that anything is really valid.
I think that's one good if this is feasible, it's going to be one area where people are going to fight for it strongly, and that is lesbians would love to have a baby that has no male part. They do the same thing with the sheep, because theoretically it's possible to take some cells, nucleus of a cell out of a woman's body, implant it in her egg, and I think that's down the road, because they'll say, the government, no law can prevent this because it's a right to my body. The government already gave them that right. So that would be an interesting thing that might be coming down the pike in the future.
Well, scientists have become the priests of a secular society, of a humanist society. So many people have been conditioned to look up to them, and if they have no morals or no moral compass, then people accept that it's not necessary. If they can bring all of these miracles, so-called, to fruition, then they figure that any kind of moral restraints or biblical teachings are irrelevant. And this is what science has attempted to do consistently. The warning is that man has been so consistently through history capable of evil, you would think that it would make people wary. Of say, hey, let's take a long look at this before we proceed, because throughout history man has always been capable of misusing technological advances. If it can be misused, it will be misused. That's almost an axiom of any kind of technology. Rush mentioned the atomic weapons. Gee, what a great boon to mankind that was. Aren't we all better off for it? This genetic thing could be the next bomb waiting to go off. I mean, it could literally be the keystone to the destruction of mankind. We are sowing the seeds of our own destruction. So we better take a long, long look at it. Because of man's bad track record in making good decisions about the utilization of technology. I mean, the whole 20th century has been a panoramic of blood and death.
That's right.
Military and otherwise, genocide, all through the misapplication of technology.
Rush is right. The only thing that will prevent it is the religious character of the people, because if the last residue of Christianity that's keeping it from occurring now is erased, then there's nothing to hold back the floodgates of this sort of thing. I mean, because laws can be passed. I mean, a wicked populace will permit laws to be passed to permit this sort of thing to happen. So
we've already permitted wicked laws to be passed.
Of course. I mean, in 1973 and so many others. So the answer is not, fundamentally the answer is not legislation. The answer is regeneration of men's hearts that will lead to the right kind of legislation.
Society's going to have to come to realize that a society, to exist, has to say no to certain things.
That's right.
And the attitude in the last 30 years or so has been everything's okay. The only thing we ban is people who say no.
Yeah.
But man should be free to do anything he wants. Now we're starting to look, is that such a good idea? Maybe there are some things that go beyond the line that even non-Christians are beginning to say.
The question is man capable of internal guidance or external guidance? And the history has taught us that internal guidance has never worked.
Well, that's why we have civil law, because men are sinners. We don't have civil law to make men good, but to keep them from being as evil as they would be if we didn't have civil law. But that's why it's the responsibility of the family and the church, by the grace of God, to stress the internal man, godliness that way. And that's where, as Rush pointed out, self-government comes in. And where man is not self-governed, all sorts of external restraints are necessary, and of course that leads to a paternalistic and finally a totalitarian society. But if you have a large number of godly people, then you need fewer laws, and that of course is what the Bible presupposes. It's going to presuppose that if there's a godly order, then you're going to need very few civil laws, only those found in the Word of God, which is the way it should be in the first place.
We have thousands of them. I mean, the Bible, Russia said that we've got over 600 laws governing human behavior. That ought to be enough for anybody.
Absolutely.
Why do we think we got to generate 3,000 more a year just in the state of California and thousands more at the federal level?
That's right.
I mean, if law was going to do it, we'd certainly have done it by now.
That's right.
We have another question that isn't one that will require too much time, and it's an historical question from Tim Rawlings in Milwaukee. What was Cromwell's motivation in taking most to the sword at Drogheda and Wexford in his Irish campaign? His thinking, beliefs, religious motivation? Well, first of all, to answer that question, we have to recognize that the rules of warfare at that time said that under certain circumstances you could call for the surrender of a city or a fortress, and if they did not surrender within the given time, then every last one of them could be killed, and this was routinely done. Whether we like it or not, that was true. Then we have to look back at what preceded this. In the century or so before Cromwell's time, England had waged continuous warfare against Ireland. It was a brutal kind of warfare. What Cromwell did was small compared to what the English and the Irish both did during that long period of warfare. It's one of the most horrifying stories ever told. And the evil from those massacres, which were not according to the rules of warfare, they were arbitrary, linger to this day and color the mind of all the Irish. It's one of the ugly chapters in the history of the Western world. So you have that background. Then, second, one of the terrible things that King Charles I did in his war against Parliament and against the New Model Army headed by Cromwell was to bring over an Irish army. Well, the English knew full well whether they were royalist or whether they were Puritans. what had been done to Ireland. And they expected the same kind of very fearful massacre to take place on a routine basis with that Irish army. The only reason why it did not take place on a massive scale was that Cromwell acted quickly and defeated that Irish royalist army. So there was a great deal of precedent, a great deal of fear on both sides. Cromwell had a very clear-cut legal precedent in that the laws of warfare, and he abided by them strictly, did permit what he did. He also was faced with the fact that Irish campaigns in the past, because of the inability to bring them to a quick finish, dragged on to the point of radical attrition of the English forces. He had to end the war, or the death toll would have been greater. And so he did what he did. Now, even one Irish historian in recent years has said that Cromwell was within the law in everything that he did. That doesn't mean we necessarily agree, but we have to judge a man by the standards of his day and his biblical view of things, which was that in the long run he would save more lives, Irish and English, by doing what he did and bringing the war to a quick finish. Any reactions to that? The interesting thing to me is that to this day you would think that was the one atrocity that ever occurred in Ireland. But when you go back and read what took place under Queen Elizabeth alone, and then King James, you have to say it was a small thing by comparison. But the English hold it against Cromwell because they dislike the Puritans, and the Irish hold it against Cromwell because he was a Puritan. And that was apparently his great sin in the matter, because the death toll was not equal to things that had happened long before he set foot in Ireland and after he left Ireland. The history of Ireland is a grim one, and the British were very brutal. The Irish, they felt, were a difficult people to deal with, and from their perspective they were. The first conquerors of Ireland were the Norsemen, and they finally gave up. It wasn't that they hadn't conquered them, but the Irish scene was so volatile, and the many, many Irish kings and princes would shift sides so quickly. They had their own personal warfare, and the people who were your allies today, the Vikings found, could be your enemies tomorrow, and somebody else was your ally. And they finally said, you cannot, putting it in modern language, keep a scorecard on these people. And so they pulled out in disgust. That was what kept Ireland from gaining a unity on its own. It only gained a unity under the English, a forced unity. Sadly enough, after the fall of Rome, the great people of Europe were the Irish monks and the Syrian monks. Those two were responsible for Christianizing Europe, even into the north and Central Europe as well. There are still graveyards in some parts of Europe, southern France I know, peopled by Syrian monks with Syrian inscriptions. We don't hear much about the conversion of Europe by these two groups, the Irish and the Syrians. The Syrians for a long time had a very strong and missionary-minded church. But one of the things that happened with Ireland was that it should have become united. Now, in the days of ancient Greece, as we all know, there were city-states, Athens plus a fair amount of farming countryside around it, then Sparta and Corinth, each its own little kingdom. And there was a good reason for that, because it was a difficult task to govern an area when you were some distance from it. It was Alexander the Great who created a vast empire, but nobody was able to hold it together. And then Rome, and Rome was able to hold it together. But it took improved communications in order to keep the remote areas together. And that's one reason why Rome built up such a network of magnificent highways. Well, Ireland never did develop any highways, and the roads were mud holes a good deal of the year, as the English found out, and lost a great deal trying to get around. So Ireland did not unite, and that made it an easy victim to the English and to its own disunity, because the various little princes of Ireland each created their own jurisdiction, their army for that area, and fought against all the others as well as the English. Their disunity was what did them damage. Any comments from any of you about that?
Well, as to Cromwell's motivation, I think he was a guileless Christian man. You read his public speeches and his private papers and correspondence, you get the impression that he wanted to honor God. He didn't always do it perfectly, like none of us, but I don't think he was not a totalitarian at heart or anything like that.
No.
I think he was a good man that wanted to honor God.
Well, there are some good books on Cromwell out there. One is by Antonia Fraser. Another is by Christopher Hill, which is quite outstanding. But there are many older ones, and all go into this at some length. But it's fashionable in academic quarters to beat up on Cromwell and to pay no attention to the fact that these two massacres, and that's what they were according to the rules of warfare, and they were not as bad as some that had taken place in the time of some of the Tudors. England was determined for what she felt were good reasons to keep control of Ireland. Now, we may not agree with her reasons, but they had their justification of a sort. And it was this. They had become Anglican. They had broken with the Church of Rome. And if Ireland, being Catholic, was free, then it would ally itself with Spain or France. And both realms had designs on England. In fact, in Elizabeth's day, it was a very present fear that Spain would seek to conquer Britain. And of course, we all know the story of the Armada and how a storm destroyed them together with the faster moving, smaller Spanish or English ships. But it was a valid fear. This does not mean that the actions they took were valid, because they attempted to impose Anglicanism on Ireland. And Ireland, which had been independent of Rome previously, and you had your independent Church of Ireland with its Archbishop at Armagh, turned intensely Catholic out of hostility to the English, and until recently have been very pro-Catholic. Now that's beginning to change, not for the best of reasons. Well, our time is over now. Let me say yes, Mark, did you have a question?
No.
We do welcome questions. Some we'll be able to answer, others we won't be able to answer, but we welcome them all. We'll do the best that we can, and we appreciate your interest. Thank you all for listening.